The insult heard across the stars. The Grand Conclave Station had seen many things in its 400 years of existence. It had seen wars end with a handshake. It had seen new species walk through its gates for the first time, blinking in the bright artificial light, nervous and small and full of hope. It had seen deals made in dark corners and lies told in bright halls. But it had never seen anything quite like the morning that Ambassador Elena Vasquez arrived. She came alone. That was the first thing people noticed. Most delegations arrived with guards, advisors, translators, and assistants carrying stacks of documents. The Vorath delegation alone had arrived with 47 individuals, including 6 armed soldiers, who stood at the doors of every room General Kravanzel entered. But Elena Vasquez stepped off the shuttle with a single bag over one shoulder, a dark blue jacket with the small silver pin of the United Earth Diplomatic Corps on the lapel, and nothing else. She shook hands with the station clerk who greeted her, asked him where the coffee machine was, and walked calmly to her quarters. She was 43 years old. She had black hair going gray at the edges, a quiet face, and dark eyes that missed nothing. She had spent 20 years in diplomatic work on Earth, on Mars, on the outer colonies, and in 3 previous alien contact missions. She spoke 4 human languages and 2 alien ones. She did not raise her voice. She did not make big gestures. People who met her for the first time often thought she seemed ordinary, and then later, when they were alone, they could not explain why they felt she was one of the most dangerous people they had ever met. The summit was called the Conclave of 14 Stars. It was supposed to be a step forward. For the past 2 years, the United Earth government had been negotiating with the Galactic Interspecies Assembly for formal recognition, real recognition, not the polite, distant kind, but actual trade rights, legal standing, and protection under galactic law. 47 species were members of the assembly. Humanity was not. Humanity was still considered what the aliens called a young species, a term that sounded respectful, but mostly meant they did not take humans seriously. The Vorath were the most powerful species in the assembly. They had the largest fleet, the most territory, and the longest military history of any known civilization. General Kravanzel was the face of that power. He was tall, nearly 7 feet, with 4 arms, gray-green skin like old stone, and eyes the color of copper. He had won 11 wars. He had never negotiated from a position of weakness in his life. He did not believe in weakness. He found it disgusting in others. He had looked at the human delegation brief before the summit and felt something close to boredom. A small species, a single planet, and a handful of colonies. A fleet that his 7th Armada could destroy in an afternoon. He did not understand why the assembly was even allowing this summit to happen. The first 2 days went smoothly enough. There were opening speeches. There were formal greetings between delegations. Ambassador Vasquez sat through all of it with a calm face and took careful notes on a small paper pad she carried everywhere, which several alien delegates found strange. They used digital systems. She smiled when asked about it and said she liked the feel of writing by hand. Some of them thought that was charming. Some thought it was primitive. On the morning of the 3rd day, the real negotiations began. The main hall of the conclave station was enormous. A circular room with a domed ceiling made of clear material that showed the stars outside. Representatives of 47 species sat in curved rows around a central floor. Translators worked quietly in small booths along the walls. Everything was recorded. Everything was transmitted live to member worlds across the galaxy. Ambassador Vasquez stood at the central podium and presented the human case. She spoke clearly and without drama. She laid out numbers, population figures, economic output, military capacity, colony data, scientific contribution. She spoke about what humanity could offer the assembly and what the assembly could offer humanity. She did not beg. She did not perform. She simply made the case, the way a person states facts that they know to be true. When she finished, there was a short silence. Then General Kravanzel stood. He did not go to the podium. He walked down from his seat, across the open floor, until he was standing a few feet from Ambassador Vasquez. The room went very quiet. His 6 soldiers moved slightly, but did not step forward. Every camera in the hall tracked him. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he spoke in Vorath, and the translation came through the speakers, half a second later. "You speak well," he said, "for something that has not yet earned the right to speak at all." The room stirred. A few delegates shifted uncomfortably. No one said anything. Vasquez looked at him without blinking. "Thank you for your feedback, General. If you have specific concerns about the proposal, I am happy to address them." He tilted his head. There was something in his expression that was not quite a smile. "Your kind reminds me of a creature on my homeworld. Small, loud. It makes noise when it wants food. We do not negotiate with it. We simply decide whether to keep it or not." More uncomfortable movement in the room. Still, no one spoke. Vasquez kept her voice level. "I understand you have concerns about humanity's status. That is precisely why this forum exists, so that concerns can be..." He hit her. It was not a punch. It was an open-handed strike across the face, deliberate, controlled, the kind of blow a person delivers not in anger, but in contempt. The kind that says, "You are not worth my anger." The sound of it was very loud in the quiet room. Elena Vasquez's head snapped to the side. She caught herself on the edge of the podium. Her small paper notepad fell to the floor. For 1 second, just one, she was still. The room was absolutely silent. 47 species, hundreds of delegates, all of them frozen. Some looked away, some stared. A few made sounds in their own languages that might have been shock. Not one of them stood up. Not one of them spoke. Cravanzel turned and walked back toward his seat, as if he had simply made a point on a whiteboard. Elena Vasquez straightened up slowly. She touched the corner of her mouth with 2 fingers and looked at the blood there. Then she looked up, across the room, at the general's back. She picked up her notepad from the floor. She gathered her documents from the podium, one by one, neat and unhurried. She tucked them under her arm. She looked out at the silent room at all the species who had seen and said nothing, and her face showed nothing at all. Then she looked directly at Cravanzel, who had sat back down in his chair and was already speaking quietly to an aide as if the moment was already over. She said 9 words, quiet, steady. The translator picked them up and carried them to every speaker in the room. "You have no idea what you just started." She walked out. The hall remained silent for a long time after the doors closed behind her. Several delegates tried to speak at once. The assembly moderator called for order. Cravanzel sat with his arms folded and his copper eyes half closed, looking at nothing in particular. Only one person in the room looked at the door through which Vasquez had left and felt something that was not contempt or confusion, but something much closer to fear. That was Cravanzel's own intelligence advisor, a quiet creature named Sev, who had spent 6 years studying humans and their history. He had read about their wars. He had read about what they did when they were pushed. He had filed 17 reports on the subject, none of which the general had ever read. He sat very still and watched the door and thought about all the things he knew. Then he opened a private channel on his communicator and began typing a message to his counterpart back on the Vorath homeworld. The message was short. It said, "I need you to begin updating your emergency files. All of them." Outside the station's great viewports, the stars were very calm and very far away. They did not know yet what had been set in motion in that quiet room. But they would. Everything would know, soon enough. The vote back home. The footage reached Earth in 6 hours and 42 minutes. It did not arrive through official channels. It arrived the way most things arrive first, through people. A communications technician on the Conclave station sent a compressed file to her sister on Luna Colony. That sister posted 3 seconds of it on a public network. Within 20 minutes, the full recording had been copied, recopied, translated into every human language, and was playing on every screen, on every inhabited world and station that humanity called home. People watched a woman stand at a podium and speak calmly and professionally. They watched a large gray-green alien walk up to her and say she was not worth speaking at all. They watched him hit her. They watched her fall against the podium. They watched the room full of alien delegates do nothing. Not one of them. Not one voice. Not one hand raised. And then they watched her stand up, pick up her notepad, and say 9 words in the quietest, most certain voice anyone had ever heard. Then the screens were just people's faces, everywhere. In apartments on Earth, in mining stations in the asteroid belt, in colony domes on Mars. Just people, watching the same thing, in silence. It lasted about 30 seconds. And then everyone started talking at once. The World Assembly went into emergency session 4 hours after the footage broke. It was the fastest emergency session in the body's history. By the time the delegates took their seats, the public networks were already overwhelmed, not with panic, not with chaos, but with something far more focused. People were not screaming. They were not breaking things. They were writing to their representatives. They were signing petitions. They were having very calm, very serious conversations about what came next. This was something that alien civilizations had never quite understood about humans. When humans were truly, deeply angry, not the surface kind of angry, the kind that fades in a day, they got quiet. They got organized. They started making lists. Ambassador Vasquez arrived back on Earth 30 hours after leaving the conclave station. She walked through the arrivals hall of New Geneva Spaceport with the same bag she had left with. There were no cameras allowed inside, she had requested that. But several people who were there said later that she looked exactly the same as always. Calm, unhurried, like a person who had already finished processing something and was now simply moving on to the next step. She went directly to the World Assembly chambers. She did not sleep first. She did not change clothes. When she walked into the chamber, the delegates stood, every one of them. The room held 412 representatives from every nation and major colony that humanity governed. They stood, and they did not make noise, which was unusual for that room. They just stood. She took her place at the speaker's podium and looked out at them for a moment. "You all saw what happened," she said. "So I am not going to describe it. What I am going to do is tell you what I believe it means. And then I am going to sit down, and you are going to decide what to do about it." She spoke for 40 minutes. She did not raise her voice once. She laid out the facts of humanity's current position in the galactic community: small, unrecognized, considered harmless. She laid out what the strike meant in terms of galactic politics. It was a message to every species in the assembly that humans could be treated. However, the Vorath pleased, because the Vorath did not expect consequences. She laid out what doing nothing would mean, not just for Earth, but for every young species that came after humanity. Every small civilization that would someday sit in that hall and wonder if they were safe. Then she said one more thing, and this was the part that people remembered. "I am not asking you to do this for me. What happened to me is not the point. I have a bruised jaw and a small cut. I have had worse. The point is that in a room full of civilizations who call themselves advanced, not one of them said a word. Not because they were afraid of what the Vorath would do to them, but because they did not think we were worth the trouble of defending. That is what we are dealing with. That is what has to change." She sat down. The debate lasted 11 hours. It was long, and it was real, and people said things they meant. Some argued for sanctions. Some argued for a formal complaint through the Assembly's legal process. Some argued that military action was reckless, that humanity's fleet was not large enough, that the Vorath were too powerful, that there had to be another way. The people who argued for patience were not cowards. They made reasonable points. They talked about supply lines and fleet numbers and the risk to the outer colonies. They were being careful the way people who love something are careful with it. But in the end, the room voted. The declaration of total wartime footing passed with 94% approval. It was not a simple declaration of war. It was something more specific and more serious than that. It was a full restructuring of the human economy, government, and military under a single coordinated mandate. Every shipyard in human space on Earth, on Mars, in the belt, on the outer colony moons, moved immediately to around-the-clock production. Every officer on reserve status was recalled. Research facilities that had been working on civilian projects were redirected overnight. Supply networks were reorganized. Fuel reserves were consolidated. It happened fast. That was the thing that surprised people later, how fast it happened. Not because humans panicked, because they had practiced. Because somewhere in the long tradition of human history, in all the wars and disasters and near extinctions that had shaped them, they had learned to build systems that could be switched, quickly and cleanly, From peace to war. The alien intelligence networks picked up the changes within 72 hours. Reports began flowing into capitals across the galaxy. Most of the analysts, reading those reports, concluded that humanity was making noise, performing military readiness to seem more serious than they were. The consensus was that they would settle down in a few weeks and come back to the negotiating table with different demands. The Vorath High Command received a full briefing. General Kravanzel was in the room when it was presented. The briefing concluded that the human response was emotionally driven and strategically unsound. It recommended monitoring, but no change in posture. Kravanzel sat through the briefing with his arms folded. When it was over, he did not say what his intelligence advisor Sev had told him that morning. He did not mention the 17 reports sitting unread in his private files. He did not tell his commanders about the look in Vasquez's eyes before she walked out of the hall. He sat, and he said nothing, and the meeting ended, and everyone went back to their work feeling confident that nothing had really changed. That night, alone in his office, Kravanzel pulled up the footage himself. He watched it from the beginning. He watched the human woman present her case. He watched himself walk across the floor. He watched himself strike her. He watched her fall and then stand and then speak. He watched her face. He sat back in his chair and stared at the ceiling for a long time. Then he opened a document on his private terminal and began writing a personal report, not an official one, not one that would go through the normal channels. A private memo, addressed to no one. He titled it, "On the Nature of Creatures That Do Not Run." He got 2 paragraphs in before he stopped. He closed the document without saving it. He sat in the dark for a while. Outside his window, the stars of the Vorath home system glittered in the deep black. His fleet sat in orbit above him, hundreds of ships, the finest warships the Dominion had ever built. He told himself it was enough. He was not sure he believed it anymore. Number. What humans do when cornered. 6 months passed. The galaxy watched and waited, and mostly concluded that nothing was really happening. There were no big human fleet movements, no aggressive transmissions, no ultimatums. Humanity had gone quiet, and most species took quiet to mean surrender, a gradual, dignified backing down that everyone could pretend was a strategic choice. There were even a few opinion pieces published in galactic academic journals about how the human response had been appropriately measured, and how the incident was likely to be resolved through back-channel diplomacy within the year. Nobody asked the humans if this was true. If anyone had asked, really asked, and been willing to listen, they might have noticed things. Small things, spread very far apart, that did not look like anything on their own. A trading post on the edge of Vorath territory that had been run by a human merchant family for 12 years quietly updated its cargo manifests. A human researcher on a joint science station near the outer belt requested a transfer back to Earth for personal reasons. A fuel depot in the neutral zone that had always been stocked by human supply ships stopped, receiving orders, and did not complain about it. None of these things seemed important. They were the kind of details that disappeared into the noise of daily galactic life. That was the point. What the alien intelligence networks did not know, could not have known, because it had never been written down anywhere they could access, was that for the past 22 years, the United Earth Intelligence Division had been running a quiet program called the Long Ear. It had no official budget line. It was funded through a series of misrouted infrastructure grants. It employed, at its peak, around 400 people who lived and worked across the galaxy under completely ordinary identities: traders, teachers, engineers, doctors, scientists on joint research programs. They did not carry weapons. They did not steal secrets in dramatic ways. They simply lived their lives, watched, listened, and sent small packets of ordinary-looking data back to Earth in the background traffic of normal communications. Over 22 years, they had built a picture, a very detailed picture. When the declaration of total wartime footing passed the World Assembly, every one of those 400 people received a single coded message embedded in a routine software update. The message was 3 words long. The 3 words were, "Begin Phase 2. Within 30 days, the Earth Strategic Command had on its screens A complete map of every Vorath military installation in known space. Every supply depot. Every fleet position. Every patrol route. Every repair facility. Every command structure from the High Command down to the individual ship captains of the 7th Armada. They had communication frequencies, encryption patterns, resupply schedules, and the personal files of 217 Vorath officers. They had not stolen this information in some dramatic raid. They had simply collected it, piece by piece, over 2 decades, the way a careful person collects rainwater, a little at a time, steadily, until the barrel is full. Admiral Yusuf Okafor looked at the map for a long time when it was first presented to him. He was a tall man from Lagos, 60 years old, with close-cropped gray hair and the careful, quiet manner of someone who had spent his entire life in rooms where the wrong decision got people killed. He had commanded vessels since he was 30. He did not get excited easily. He looked at the map, and then he looked at his intelligence chief, a small, sharp-eyed woman named Dr. Priya Nair, and he said, "How long have we had this?" "Most of it," she said. "Longer than you've been an admiral." He nodded slowly. "And they have nothing like this on us? They have our public fleet manifests, our registered shipping routes, and whatever they could pick up from listening to our public communications, which we have been carefully managing for the past 18 months. Meaning? Meaning they think our active fleet is about 60% smaller than it is, and they have no idea about the deep yard facilities. The deep yard facilities were 6 shipyards built inside hollowed-out asteroids in the outer belt, in locations that appeared on no registered map. They had been operating for 9 years, producing a class of vessel that had never been publicly named or acknowledged. The ships were smaller than standard warships but fast, very fast, and built around a propulsion system that human engineers had developed entirely in-house, without galactic assembly technology, because they had never been invited to share in it. The first real engagement happened in the 5th month. A Vorath expeditionary squadron, 12 ships, sent to remind the population of a human border colony called Hayward Station, who they were dealing with, arrived to find the station completely empty. Every civilian had been evacuated 2 weeks earlier. The colony building stood dark and still. The docking rings were empty. The Vorath commander, a mid-ranked officer named Drev, found this slightly odd, but not alarming. He moved his ships into a standard holding pattern and sent a message back to command that the humans had fled. He recommended they leave a monitoring station and move on. He never sent a second message. What happened next lasted 41 minutes. The full details were never publicly released, but the basic shape of it was this. The entire Hayward system had been seeded in the 2 weeks before the Vorath arrived, with several thousand autonomous units, small, dark, cold, entirely invisible to standard scans, because they were made of materials that did not reflect the frequencies the Vorath used. They did nothing until the Vorath ships settled into their holding pattern. Then they did quite a lot, very quickly, and in a specific sequence designed to disable, rather than destroy, targeting engines, communications, and weapon systems in that order. When it was over, 11 of the 12 Vorath ships were dead in space. The 12th had managed to partially restart its engines and had limped out of the system before the units could finish their cycle. It was that ship that carried the news back to the Vorath High Command. The full after-action report landed on the High Command's table 3 days later. The room was very quiet when it was read. The generals looked at each other. Someone asked where the human fleet had been positioned during the attack. The answer was, nowhere near Hayward. No human ships had been detected in the system. There was a longer silence. Cravan Zell, who had been invited to the meeting as a formality, spoke once. He said, "What type of munitions did they use?" The analysis team had been working on that. They had recovered fragments from the Vorath hulls and run full material scans. Their conclusion was that the autonomous units were, by Vorath standards, relatively simple, not cutting edge, not the most advanced version of what humans were capable of. They used older technology, the analyst said. Based on the construction, this was not their best work. Cravan Zell sat very still. Why would they do that? Nobody answered. He answered himself, quietly, as if thinking out loud. Because they wanted us to analyze it. They wanted us to see what they chose to show us, so that when they show us something different, We will not be ready for it." The room was silent. He stood up and left without asking to be dismissed. Nobody stopped him. He walked down the long corridor outside the command chambers and stood at a window that looked out over the Vorath capital city, billions of lights below him, towers and bridges, and the long bright lines of transit systems. All of it calm and enormous and old. He thought about a woman picking up a notepad from a floor. He thought about 9 quiet words. He thought, "We should have read those reports." Then he went back to his office and began planning, privately and carefully, for what he now believed was coming. Not because he had been ordered to, because he was, before anything else, a soldier. And a soldier who has just seen the first move of a strategy recognizes that there are more moves coming. He just did not know yet how many. Number. The reckoning comes at dawn. They did not come with warnings. There was no ultimatum before the fleet moved. No dramatic broadcast. No countdown. The Vorath monitoring stations on the edge of their home system were running routine scans at the start of a standard shift when the readings changed. One moment, empty space. The next moment, ships. Hundreds of them, dropping out of faster-than-light travel in a wide arc across the outer edge of the Vorath system, so spread out that for a few seconds, the monitoring technicians thought their instruments were malfunctioning. They were not malfunctioning. The technician who sent the first alert later said that what she remembered most was not the number of ships but the way they moved. Vorath fleets moved in tight formations, controlled, orderly, every vessel exactly where doctrine said it should be. These ships spread wide and kept spreading, covering an area of space so large that no single defensive battery could cover more than a fraction of it. It was not the movement of a fleet that had come to charge. It was the movement of a fleet that had come to stay. Admiral Yusuf Okafor stood on the bridge of the EAS, times long memory, times the flagship of the first human battle fleet, and watched the spread complete itself on the tactical display. Around him, his bridge crew worked quietly. No one was excited. No one made noise. They had trained for this day for 2 years, and trained people do not celebrate the beginning of something difficult. They focus. Beside the human ships, arranged in their own formation, along the fleet's left flank, were the vessels of 11 other species. This was the part that no one outside a very small circle of people had known about. For the 6 months that the galaxy had been watching and waiting for humanity to calm down, Ambassador Vasquez had not been calm. She had been traveling, quietly, without press coverage, without fanfare. She had visited 14 different worlds, species that had no love for the Vorath Dominion, species that had been pushed out of trade routes, or had colonies absorbed into Vorath territory, or had sat in rooms and watched themselves be ignored, while Vorath generals made decisions that affected them without their input. She had not offered them money. She had not made grand speeches about justice. She had sat with their leaders, often just 2 or 3 people in a small room, and she had listened first. She let them talk about their own situations, their own frustrations, their own histories with the Dominion. And then she had said, simply, "We are going to do something about this. You do not have to fight. You do not have to put your people at risk. But if you want to stand with us officially, visibly, we would be glad to have you." 11 of the 14 said yes. Their ships were not large. Some were old. None of them would have made a Vorath admiral nervous on their own. But they were there. And their presence in that fleet said something that no weapon could have said as clearly. It said, "You are not dealing with one species. You are dealing with everyone you have pushed too far, finally in the same place at the same time." Admiral Okafor opened a channel on all frequencies, every band, every language used in the Vorath Dominion, and he spoke. His translator, a young woman named Aiko Tanaka who had grown up on a station near Vorath space and spoke their language without an accent, rendered his words perfectly in real time. This is Admiral Yusuf Okafor of the United Earth Armed Forces, speaking on behalf of the governments of Earth and her allied species. We are not here to destroy your world. We are not here to kill your people. We are here because a man in a position of power struck a woman who came to talk in peace in front of the entire galactic community, and your government called it nothing. We are here to make sure it is not nothing. We are requesting the immediate surrender of General Kravanzel to the custody of the Galactic Assembly for trial. We are requesting the dissolution of the Vorath Military Command Council and its replacement by a civilian-led government body under assembly oversight. These are our terms. You have 26 hours. We are patient people. The channel closed. The Vorath High Command met in emergency session within minutes of the broadcast. There were 12 generals in the room, and one High Chancellor, an old civilian named Vorath Essa, who had held the position for 30 years and had spent most of that time signing off on whatever the military told him to. He sat at the head of the table now and looked at his generals and felt, for the first time in his long career, that he was not sure who was actually in charge. The generals were not afraid. Not exactly. They were angry. And underneath the anger there was a thing they were working hard not to look at directly, which was the fact that the numbers were not what they should have been. The human fleet was larger than it should have been able to be. The Allied species ships changed the calculation in ways that the strategic computers were still working through, and the Hayward engagement sat in the back of every military mind in the room like a stone that would not be moved. They voted to fight. Of course they voted to fight. They were Vorath generals. They did not back down. The battle that followed lasted 19 hours. It did not look like any battle the Vorath had ever fought. Their doctrine was built on overwhelming force: mass your ships, break the enemy line, dictate terms from a position of complete dominance. It had worked for 11 wars across 2 centuries. They knew how to fight an enemy that met them head-on. Human ships did not meet them head-on. They moved in ways that the Vorath tactical computers could not fully predict. They split and rejoined and split again, drawing Vorath formations out of position and then hitting the gaps. They targeted specific systems on specific ships, not trying to destroy, but to disable, which was harder and required more precision, but which also meant the battle space filled up with dead and drifting Vorath ships that their own fleet had to navigate around. They communicated in short bursts of encoded signal that the Vorath could hear but could not read, and they changed frequencies every few minutes, so every attempt to jam them started over from scratch. The Allied species ships stayed on the flank and did something very specific. They prevented retreat. Not aggressively. They did not have to be aggressive. They simply held a position that made any Vorath attempt to pull back into a different formation very costly. They were, in the language of an old Earth chess game, the pieces that controlled the edges of the board while the main force worked in the center. 8 hours in, the Vorath lost their command ship. Admiral Okafor had identified it in the first 10 minutes of the battle, not because it was the biggest ship, but because of the way the other ships responded to it. The tiny delays in formation changes that happened on the side of the fleet furthest from its position. Once it was gone, the Vorath formation decisions slowed. Not much. Enough. By hour 16, the outer defensive ring of the Vorath home system had been neutralized. Not destroyed, neutralized. Ships disabled, stations taken offline, communication arrays silenced. The human fleet sat between the Vorath homeworld and the rest of its military assets, calm and organized, going nowhere. At hour 19, High Chancellor Vorath Essa overruled his remaining generals and opened a communication channel. He said, in a very tired voice, that he wished to discuss terms. Admiral Okafor's response was immediate and short. "We are glad to hear that, Chancellor, but I am not the right person for that conversation. I am going to give you a different frequency. Call that one." The frequency connected to a small ship at the back of the human formation, a diplomatic vessel, unarmed, that had traveled with the fleet from the beginning. On that ship, sitting at a small table with a cup of coffee and her paper notepad, was Ambassador Elena Vasquez. She accepted the call. She looked at the face of the High Chancellor on the screen, old, tired, the skin around his copper eyes looser than Cravanzel's, the look of a man who understood what he was looking at, and she said, "Hello, Chancellor. I believe we had an unfinished conversation. I'm ready to finish it now, if you are." The Chancellor looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at something off-screen, possibly a window, possibly a display showing him the state of his fleet. "Yes," he said. "I believe we are." In the brig of a Vorath command station that had been quietly taken offline 6 hours earlier, General Cravanzel sat in a chair and stared at the wall. He was not injured. He had not fought when they came for him. He had simply looked at the officer who entered the room, a young human lieutenant, barely 25, completely calm, and he had stood and put his hands behind his back. He was thinking about what Sev had told him, a year ago. He was thinking about 17 unread reports. He was thinking about 9 quiet words. Number A. New order, written in quiet words. 1 year later, the Grand Conclave Station looked the same. The domed ceiling still showed the stars. The curved rows of seats still held delegates from dozens of species. The translation booths still hummed quietly along the walls. The floor of the main hall, where everything had started, was the same polished gray material it had always been. Nothing about the room had changed. Everything else had. The species sitting in the seats were different, not all of them, but many of the faces were new. Several member governments had changed hands in the year since the war ended. The Vorath Dominion had a civilian council now, elected in a process that the Assembly had helped oversee, made up of people who had never commanded a warship and had no interest in doing so. They sat in the seats that Vorath generals had once filled, and they sat quietly, and they listened more than they talked, which was new for them. 3 species that had not been members of the Assembly before were present as full members today. 2 of them were species that had allied with humanity during the conflict. The third was a small civilization from the far edge of the mapped galaxy, tiny, young, barely space-capable, who had watched what happened and sent a formal membership application the week after the Conclave Accords were announced. Their representative was barely an adult by their species standards. She sat in her seat and looked at everything with very large eyes, and took notes on a device that looked, to human observers, a little like a paper notepad. Ambassador Elena Vasquez noticed this from across the room and felt something warm and quiet move through her chest. She did not say anything about it. She was standing near the signing table, reviewing the final language of the accords, with a small team of human and alien lawyers, when the Assembly moderator came to tell her they were ready to begin. The Conclave Accords were 47 pages long. They had taken 9 months to negotiate and write. They covered a great deal of ground trade law, territorial rights, the legal status of young species seeking membership, rules about diplomatic conduct and immunity, a process for handling disputes without military action, and the formation of a permanent joint security force that would be drawn from member species on a rotating basis. But the part that everyone talked about, the part that was short and clear and had been debated the longest, was the section on what the Assembly called fundamental dignitary conduct. It was 4 sentences. It said, in language that left no room for interpretation, that no representative of any member species could be subject to physical violence, intimidation, or deliberate humiliation at any Assembly function or in any formal diplomatic context. It said that any violation of this standard would be treated not as an individual act, but as an act of the government that person represented. It said that all member species were responsible not only for their own conduct, but for responding to violations by others. It said that silence was not neutrality. That last sentence had been Vasquez's. The lawyers had told her it was too direct. She had kept it anyway. General Cravanzel had been tried 5 months earlier. The trial was public, transmitted live to every member world, and conducted under a new legal framework that had been drafted by a joint committee of 12 species, including humans, over 3 months of very hard work. The charges were formal diplomatic assault, deliberate violation of Assembly Convention, and conduct intended to destabilize interspecies relations. He had not denied any of it. He had sat in the defendant's chair with his arms folded and his copper eyes steady, and he had listened to the charges read aloud. And then he had said, in Vorath, that he accepted responsibility for his actions. He did not apologize. He said the word responsible, and meant it in the way a soldier means it, not with regret, but with acknowledgement. He understood what he had done. He understood what it had cost. He was sentenced to 10 years of civilian service under Assembly supervision, not prison, but structured work, rebuilding infrastructure and systems that had been damaged during the conflict. Some species thought the sentence was too light. Some thought it was surprisingly serious for what had been, physically, a single blow. Vasquez had said nothing publicly about the sentence. When a reporter asked her how she felt about it, she said, I feel that the process worked. That is what I care about. The signing ceremony was not long. That had been deliberate. Vasquez did not want it to be a performance. She had seen enough performances in enough halls to last a lifetime. What she wanted was what they had: 41 species, represented by their chosen delegates, coming to a table and putting their mark on a document that said, "We agree that this is how it should work." The representatives came to the table one by one. Some signed with their own biological marks. Some used devices that recorded their biometric signature. The human delegation used ink pens, the old kind, because Vasquez had requested it and no one had argued with her about anything in quite some time. When the last signature was recorded, the room was still for a moment. Then it was not still, there was sound, not cheering exactly, but something like release. Voices in a dozen languages saying things to each other. Delegates turning to the people beside them. The long breath that a room takes when something difficult is finally done. Vasquez stayed at the table. She capped her pen and put it in her jacket pocket, a habit, saving things. She looked down at the document in front of her and thought about all the rooms she had sat in over the past year. The small rooms where she had listened to alien leaders talk about their history with the Dominion. The military briefing rooms where Admiral Okafor had walked her through plans she had no technical training to evaluate, but trusted because she trusted him. The negotiation sessions that had lasted 12 and 14 hours at a stretch, where the lawyers fought over individual words for days, and she had sat at one end of the table, drinking bad coffee, and letting them fight, because the words mattered, and the fighting was the point. She thought about a floor, a notepad falling, a room full of people who did not speak. She thought, it was worth it. It was always going to be worth it. Someone touched her arm gently. She looked up. It was a young Vorath diplomat. She recognized him from the new Civilian Council's delegation. He was young by Vorath standards, which meant he looked to human eyes like someone in his mid-30s. He had lighter skin than most Vorath she had met, and the same copper eyes as Kravon Zel, though his were softer. He had been standing nearby for a few minutes, she realized, working up to saying something. "Ambassador," he said, in careful, accented human standard. He had been learning it for 6 months. She had heard about this from the assembly staff, and had said nothing. But she had been quietly glad. "Yes," she said. He looked at her for a moment, like he was deciding whether to ask what he wanted to ask. Then he asked it. "Why did you not take more? When you had the chance, the fleet, the position, you could have taken territory. You could have demanded more. Many species would have." She considered the question. It was a real question, and it deserved a real answer. "Because we did not go out there to rule anyone," she said. "We went out there to make sure no one ever had to stand up and wipe blood from their face and say nothing ever again. We already have a home. We were fighting for the idea that everyone deserves one." The young diplomat looked at her for a long time. She could see him working through it, turning it over. Then he did something she had not expected. He bowed. It was a deep bow. Both of his upper arms folded across his chest, the formal Vorath bow, the one reserved, she knew from her reading, for people considered true equals. His species did not give that bow easily or lightly. She nodded back, the way she would have nodded to anyone, because that was the point. That was the whole point. He straightened and went back to his delegation, and she watched him go. Later, when the hall had emptied and the station staff were quietly collecting documents and resetting the room, Vasquez stood at the great viewport on the far wall and looked out at the stars. Somewhere out there, human ships and the vessels of 11 allied species were running their first joint patrol. Not as conquerors, not as an occupying force, as something that had never existed before, the beginning of something that might, if they were careful and patient and honest with each other, become a real peacekeeping force. The first one the galaxy had ever had. It was not finished. It was far from finished. There were 41 signatures on the accords, but there were hundreds of species in the galaxy, many of them not yet mapped, many of them not yet ready. And the work of building something lasting out of a single moment of crisis was the kind of work that took generations. She knew that. She had known it from the beginning. But it had started. It had started, she thought, with one man who believed that contempt had no consequences, and with one room full of people who said nothing, and with one woman who picked up her notepad and walked out and went home and said, "Not this time." She finished her coffee. She put the cup down on the windowsill. She picked up her bag, put it over one shoulder, and walked out of the hall. Behind her, the stars held still and very bright, the way they always did, patient and enormous, and completely indifferent to what small creatures did beneath them. But small creatures had done something today. Something that would last. That was enough.